folks. I hope everyone had a healthy and enjoyable lunchtime with a little conversation with friends and hopefully keeping the ideas flowing as a result of this morning's very productive session and anticipation of two equally exciting and productive sessions this afternoon. The next panel that we're going to hear from and interact with is on strong science and technology. Before I introduce them, let me just mention that those of you who were unable to interact with the previous panel should feel free to submit any comments that you have on the website for the Academy. Is a place that will indicate where you can send your comments and questions. We encourage that. And if you have trouble finding that, Liz Finkelman has volunteered to personally accept any emails that you want to direct our way. This really is a very important part of the ongoing work in progress that is the VitalDirections activity. We're very fortunate to have an extraordinary group to talk with us about strong science and technology, moderated by Elias Herhouni, who, as you all know, was previously the director of the National Institutes of Health and is now president for global R&D at Sanofi, where he's been since 2011. Joining Elias on the panel are Alan Leshner, former director of the National Institute for Drug Abuse and also the immediate past president of the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Jonathan Perlin, who is the president for clinical services and chief medical officer at HCA, Hospital Corporation of America, Ellen Siegel, who is the chairperson and founder of Friends of Cancer Research, and Janet Woodcock, who is director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration and a longtime field leader, not only at FDA, but throughout the nation for these issues. Elias, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Victor and Mark, for asking us to do this. We felt it was really important during our conversations to crystallize, if you will, what will be the essential drivers of innovation, science, technology that are going to be essential to recommendations that we may make to the next administration, but also in a self-reflecting exercise of trying to as Victor said, you know, the scope of what we're trying to do across this vital direction is like bowling the ocean. This is his own sentence. And so we try to really crystallize that, to bring it to a conversation here, where at the end of this conversation, we hope that we will have captured not only the scope, but also the priorities that we need to focus on if we are going to sustain and support the transformation of healthcare that I think all of us wish for and all of us are seeking. But we're all trying to understand what prevents us from doing it faster, better, sooner. And science and technology are going to be key to the answer to that over the next century. And when you look at it, you realize that there are multiple aspects of the science enterprise that we need to address if we're going to be effective in adjusting the healthcare system to what it needs to be. First and foremost is the notion that in fact, when you look at our science trajectory and where we are in terms of our knowledge base to be able to be effective in managing diseases, we have to be humble. We have to recognize that today we're nowhere near the physical sciences, the amount of knowledge that has been accumulated in the 20th century for physical sciences, where now the physical scientists are looking at the fundamentals of nature and the fundamentals of what happens in terms of particles and so on. In medicine and biomedical research, I think we have to recognize that even today, we do not understand, for example, the fundamental molecular causes of a disease that's been around and understood for 100 years, diabetes, even less so for Alzheimer's disease, and so on. And therefore, we are evolving, if you will, in this 21st century, a field of science that is not as mature, and we should recognize that, and needs new approaches and novel ways of looking, in fact, at how we accumulate knowledge and how we translate that knowledge into real benefits for mankind. And so the panelists today are going to address, from that point of view, from their perspective, what is essential to accomplish in each one of these areas that have been selected, for better or worse, to try to crystallize the priorities that Victor and Mark asked us to do. And so we thought that information technology, analytics, our ability to understand the world to a different level was important, and Jonathan is going to cover that. We also thought that perhaps we should question the models the models through which we conduct research. We conduct the ability for us to tackle a disease like Alzheimer's disease or diabetes, and we asked Alan to crystallize what the group's thinking is about the notion of targeted research as opposed to bottom-up, unguided research, and the pros and cons of each. As you know, this is a fundamental debate in the scientific community. Obviously, none of this can happen unless there is a terrific regulatory apparatus of informed, scientifically savvy executives. And in this case, we asked Janet, who's been really one of the world experts and drivers of change at the FDA, to tell us what it is that we need to do differently, better, and where are the obstacles. And last but not least, we asked Ellen Siegel, who has been the founder of Friends of Cancer Research, but has been more than that, because what she's been the glue between the institutions of science, political institutions, the institutions of regulation, to try to, in fact, connect and make us understand that none of us can succeed unless everyone succeeds in trying to overcome, if you will, the challenges of both research and healthcare delivery. So with that, I'll ask our panelists to actually undergo the elevator test. First, tell us what you would tell the president if you had 3 to 5 minutes and you were stuck in the elevator with him or her, and well, you would crystallize in that conversation, reminding that this is not an elevator in the Trump Tower. It's the elevator in the White House. Between the basement and the top floor, it's only 3 floors. So go ahead.
Well, thanks, Elias, and thanks to all fellow panelists and to the National Academy for this terrific forum. If I had the privilege of being stuck for 3 to 5 minutes with the president in an elevator, I would note that the president had just been with 4 colleagues who, to a person, said it all begins with data. And that knowing that data are fundamental to every strategy for research, for discovery, for point-to-point health care, that there's an opportunity that's really ripe for taking. In fact, with meaningful use and the history, the president, if you will, has bought the car. It's time to drive it. And the president's opportunity is not to drive it on a slow toll road, but really to realize the vision of a fast superhighway for information exchange that does 3 things. First, that supports the development of a data strategy for a learning health system. I'll come back momentarily and define exactly what I mean by that. Second, that the president has the opportunity to commit to end-to-end interoperability of health information that extends from the formal settings of care to the technical medical devices, but importantly, enfranchises patients as consumers of healthcare in their health data, both accepting and encompassing patient-reported outcomes as well as patient-generated data. And finally, that we have an obligation as well as an opportunity, if we meet that obligation, to aggressively address cybersecurity vulnerabilities and create protections in that regard. So let me just define a couple of terms. First, data strategy for a learning health system. Today, over 98% of hospitals, over 95% of physician practices are computerized. We're clicking, but to your point, we're not yet learning. There is, by virtue of all that clicking, a data exhaust, as the data scientists would refer to it. And within those data are answers to numerous questions. can we systematically have enough interoperability to structure those data so that we can bring it back meaningfully to decision support as knowledge and wisdom at the point of care, but also to inform population health, better and more effective health policy, and of course, discovery. And later I'll talk about some examples, but to your point on diabetes, I grew up as a lumper because paper only allowed lumping. But we now know that type 2 diabetes is probably not one disease, but there are genetics for probably 14 forms at least of diabetes. And I need the decision support to manage the variables associated with that so I can best treat in a personalized and precise way the patient's condition, technically, notwithstanding the prior discussion about meeting the patient's clinical and personal and social goals. So this notion of a learning health system is one that the organization formerly known as the Institute of Medicine defined in 2007 as a system which commits to the continuous use of data as a byproduct of care for continuous learning and improvement, a virtuous cycle, if you will. And that's a terrific aspiration for the system. Second is the end-to-end interoperability. And by that, we're not talking about a single structured monolithic system, but rather a set of architectures that take advantage of technologies that we have today, that use things like web services, that allow an ecosystem of entrepreneurship, development for utilities that can support plug-and-play clinical decision support for formal caregivers, but also the opportunity for the patient to reach in and access health information. This is very exciting. There are new standards that have very much in common with the infrastructure that we take for granted in applications that we use on our smartphones or when we use web services on the internet. There's an implication, though, that we can also get data that are extremely granular, so they're valuable to research and discovery, that we can send and receive, and that both sides of that equation work, and that the patient can be enfranchised as part of that data equation in that virtuous loop. On the cybersecurity, it's really, on the one hand, addressing the vulnerabilities, and to be clear, we're in an era where the penetrations or threats are a constant. They're significant not only in terms of their frequency, but in terms of their sophistication, even with state-sponsored actors. And so the importance of sharing threats and strategies to mitigate those threats are important, as are, frankly, policy developments to protect those organizations that really go to all of the requirements and beyond. But still may be subject to an action of a state actor or others. So that, I think, is really the opportunity for the president to really take us from the slow toll road to the fast information highway to develop a learning health system strategy that's based upon a granular interchange of data that enfranchises the patients as well as caregivers in an environment that creates the security for the actors in the health ecosystem to really place their trust and receive the intent, which is good care and social support.
So you've used up 67 floors.
It was a good ride, though.
It was a good ride. But let's say I'm the president now, and I heard you, and I'm going to push back on you. And I'm saying, well, Jonathan, I understand you were the person who ran the VA at one time when you were the undersecretary, and then now today you run Hospital Corporation of America, 167 hospitals, and you're telling about interoperability. Do you have it in the Hospital Corporation?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm pleased to say we do. Okay. And to the kind of research that you've asked about, really in a partnership with public and private sector, which I think is really a piece of the equation, and academia, a study that grew out just across the lobby here called Reduce MRSA. Is that really by virtue of the increasing standardization of data, we're able to bring 43 hospitals together and franchise 75,000 patients in a 3-arm comparative effectiveness study and determine a new mechanism that cut, on top of all known best practices, bloodstream infections by 44% and MRSA by 37%. What I think is novel is that while that was the New England Journal headline for nearly halving the infection rate, to me the other headline is that it didn't take one hospital 64 years. It took 43 hospitals 18 months. And it was extremely efficient research. We can talk about later the mechanics of that, but in a follow-up study with NIH and AHRQ and CDC, we did a reprise of that, looking at general medical and surgical units, and the opportunity was somewhat daunting. Could you get 50 hospitals together in 1 year and include 300,000 patients? We got 2 of the 3. We failed on the third criteria. We didn't get 300,000 patients. By virtue of standardized data, the platform there was available to enfranchise 666,000 patients. And in fact, this coming year, we're embarking on a study to look at iota for something against which, unlikely to gather resistance versus an antibiotic. And the signal is so subtle that it was estimated we needed at least 120 hospitals and 1 million patients. And we're into this for 140 hospitals and 1.4 million patients. And so the opportunity to begin to appreciate nuances, rare manifestations of common diseases, be able to look at rare diseases, or to look at things where the signal is subtle, for the first time exists by virtue of standardized data.
I have to say something. As the new president, I need to get reelected in 4 years. That's my job. I mean, and here you're telling me about a system that will be within hospitals, interoperable, but the people who vote are patients. So what about an electronic health record that will go along with the patient rather than you trying to, use that up? And how do I get a benefit here for the country and for the people? Should it be a patient-centric EHC health record, or should it be a system based on hospitals? Should it be insurance companies? I mean, what do you see as the scope of interoperability and cybersecurity, which is really a trust factor?
That's right.
What do you think is your recommendation there?
Well, that's a great question, President Zerhouni. The interoperability has to be inclusive.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Don't answer.
You can tell we have a good time in our group.
The interoperability really has to be end-to-end. When we say end-to-end, we really don't mean one monolithic system, but we mean a system where patients are enfranchised, where they can share their data, contribute their patient-reported outcomes, but also receive their information. It has to be a system, and this is really the last mile. We're at a point now where we have 90% of the distance covered in terms of interoperability. It is that last mile, and that's proving to be one of the most difficult parts. So the president might ask the question, how would you actually convene for the granularity of standards that are specific enough for the interchange? And by the way, harmonization doesn't work here. If the gauge for the rail on the train is off by an inch, it just doesn't meet up, but we can't be off by an inch. And there's some thinking that a public-private partnership where you could have the innovation in the private sector as well as the absolute clarity of federal signal is what's necessary to really meet that last mile. I think there are terrific exemplars of that. The National Quality Forum in the area of measures proves a very important function with respect to measures. Here's an analog with respect to standards, but it really has to be completely plug and play, because not every system, like the VA or my organization, has the capacity to weave together things that kind of match, but don't really match. When I pick up a phone, if I happen to be on AT&T and you're on Verizon, we can still communicate. That's not harmonization, that's specificity. So that voter, that taxpayer, that consumer, that patient really is entrusting to us in their expectation of care that's informed over the time of their care, across the geography, and among the members of the team, including they themselves as the patient, that we're going to put forward standards that are granular and specific enough for that end-to-end interoperability. And second, that there's the capacity not only for send, the data can be broadcast, but also for receive, that the data have been proven to meet their end target reliably. That's a pretty high bar. But this is not, ladies and gentlemen, a technology issue. As they say in computers, it's not a hardware issue, it's not a software issue, it's a warmware. It's a human issue, it's substantially a political issue, and it's one that really, if we can foster this new era of precision and personalized healthcare, if we can better inform a patient's care, what a terrific contribution over the next 4 years.
Okay, I'm convinced. So, Dr. Leshner, I hear that there's a controversy in the field of science about whether or not we should let research emerge from the best minds and not drive it, not target it, and then others who say without a targeting, we will not make fast enough progress at a fast enough speed. And so your group was charged to look at the role of targeted research in the future in healthcare and biomedical research. And so you have not as much as the Trump Tower, but half the Trump Tower.
Actually, I was planning to use the London Eye as the model, and moves very slowly around that Ferris wheel. So, Madam or Mr. President, you may choose. Among the many challenges that you're facing, you'll discover rapidly that science and technology are embedded in all of them, either as a cause or a cure. And you're going to be faced with the problem of how best to bring the power of science to bear on dealing with those issues. There are basically three sets of issues that you have to worry about. One is, how do you decide among the pressing needs? What are the criteria that you would use in addition to, we've got a crisis, but you got a lot of crises. Where are you going to invest most heavily? Secondly, the philosophies and the strategy that you're going to use. And third, the content of what's going to be in these initiatives. So it's true, and every president has directly or indirectly had these initiatives, and they generally can be great. They draw attention to a problem, they recruit scientists to work on it, and then they help solve them more rapidly. HIV/AIDS, many types of cancer, Human Genome Project, they've all been very helpful. However, they're very controversial because at their core, scientists are also people, and they're worried. Every time there's an initiative, is it going to help lose my grant? So you can't overdo it. You also can't overdo it because the core of America's progress in science and its ultimate ability to serve society is dependent on sort of what's called bottoms-up, field-driven, curiosity-driven science that is the core of innovation, and innovation's the core of great future stuff. So let me get to the first question. How do you decide what to do? Certain set of criteria should be applied. The first is always money, so we're not going to talk about money. It has to be that the scientific issues or questions are tractable. We need to have a strong enough science base that we actually can do something. If you're picking, pick winners. Secondly, there has to be an appropriate workforce that actually can do the work. And third, there need to be typically complementary policy and regulatory initiatives that you can accomplish. Second question, how do you do it? How much detail and how much specificity do you prescribe in an initiative? How much of it should be targeted in the literal sense? How much of it should depend on the field? And I would say that in part depends on the first question that I asked, the state of the science. But secondly, remembering that there has to be a balance, there has to be enough open-endedness that you can take advantage of the creativity that's inherent in the scientific community. We can come back to that question again. The third question is going to be what should be in the initiative. First of all, we need new tools and technologies all the time. Technology is driving science as much as science is driving the development of new technologies and innovation. Secondly, particularly biomedical science is a small science enterprise, but solving big problems is a big science issue, and therefore we have to have new models and mechanisms to support large-scale research consortia, public-private partnerships. We want to make sure that whatever it is ultimately will get translated into useful products and practices and treatments. The third, and this gets back to the data issue, is we are very much proprietary people, us scientists. You can't let us overdo it. There have to be processes and a regulatory framework that fosters data sharing, materials sharing, and ultimately a greater ability to collaborate between industry and academic scientists. If you put these three elements together in the scale, in the balance that's going to weigh what you choose to focus on and how you do it, I think you'll have a better shot at success.
Very interesting. So what initiative do you think I should take in the next 4 years to get reelected?
So, you know, everybody's worried about their demise both physically and intellectually. So our paper, our group, I have to represent my group, of course, is 3 former NIH Neuroscience Institute directors. What do you think we chose as an example? So take that as a given, okay? But then you want to take the greatest need, and often that's a crisis mode, but so be it. Zika is the best example that you can think of. And then you have to go after it in a very focused way.
I would say that, you know, my head of CDC told me that neuroscience issues are going to be driving healthcare needs, both in neuropsychiatry as well as degenerative diseases. And yes, the tools are new. There are new tools. There isn't maybe as much knowledge and ability to intervene rationally. But on the other hand, you know, of all the initiatives, I'm told that HIV/AIDS were done pretty well, and HCV were done pretty well, and cancer, there are tons of them. And if I want to be original, I would do neurosciences.
I agree with you. Let me just emphasize something you just said. That is that the biggest problem we have in the development of new treatments is the lack of fundamental understanding of the pathophysiology of, in my case, mental and addictive disorders. We serendipitously have all these treatments, but none of them have been based on a fundamental understanding of the science. We need to have a major effort to push that, or industry, who has moved away from CNS disorders because of the lack of targets, the lack of understanding. Industry won't come back unless the basic science community, unless the clinical science community comes up with better understanding.
And so in your opinion then of the healthcare system of today, what needs to change? If you,
the
ecosystem of both healthcare and innovation, what needs to change in your mind to get to this pathogenesis understanding of the true causes of diseases? And
my own view is that we've got to get past, at least some of my colleagues in the audience are about to hate me, by the way. We have got to get past the impression that we do science solely because it's interesting and intellectually stimulating. We do science, the country supports science because it's ultimately useful. That same mindset should be applied. We want to have a fundamental understanding, for example, of the brain, but as we do that, we want to make sure that we have in the back of our own heads the importance of understanding disease. And I think when you have that, it changes some of the questions that you ask.
So you're advocating really for a balanced investment strategy where you don't give up on fundamentals because those are the ones that are going to give you the insights.
They're going to give you the insights and the future.
In the future.
I think the data are so clear that innovation, novelty, right? Novelty comes about from being unpredictable rather than predictable. If we're targeting, we're over-predicting often. So the argument is that you want novelty, you want to accept novelty, and frankly, one climactic issue that has to be addressed is the conservative nature of current peer review and funding, but that's a separate issue. I'll whine about that separately. But in fact, we need to have a balance between letting 1,000 flowers bloom within a domain and trying to get answers to specific questions.
Well, Janet, obviously none of this can happen unless it's safe and effective for the public. And that means that all innovation in medicine, device development, truly has to be based on strong regulatory science. And as the science is changing and the research modes are changing and the demands of the public are different, as we know, and then payers now no longer look at randomized clinical trials, the end-all be-all of deciding what rewards innovation or what doesn't, what's value in innovation. How do you see the world evolving from your point of view? You've been the leader at FDA for 20 years, following the Critical Path Initiative and finding ways of making sure that we do not disappoint the public in view of the progress that is made.
Well, I'd pick up on what the two other panelists have said so far, and probably what Ellen is going to say if I know her. I believe that the regulator is going to has to evolve along with these other parts of the enterprise. And I think the most important thing I would say to a president is, look, you have your basic science, your clinical trial world out here, you have your data world over here, you have your healthcare over here, and you have the actual human experience somewhere over here. And the real challenge to make this dynamic and work is to bring these together, all right? So how do we make sure that these are all in service of the patient? That's what the regulators are supposed to be doing as well. So how do we evolve now that we have the tools? We have the data tools, we have the infrastructure tools, they're there. The science is getting to a point where we can pick it up and utilize it in some cases. How do we bring these different, disparate areas together and make them function together? And I think Jonathan has talked about some of that. I think Alan has talked about some of it. For the regulators in particular, because we regulate a lot of the clinical research, it's a lot about how do we make clinical research actually be the purview of the whole community, healthcare community. That's part of a learning healthcare system, is the engagement in research, okay, on behalf of the patients and learning from that. So these things are large challenges, but they pose, in my mind, tremendous opportunities. So how would you do that? Well, we've already heard some parts of that. I think also we need to figure out how to extend clinical research now that we do have electronic health records. We have our Sentinel system, for example, with all the claims data in there and so forth. How do we actually do research in this environment and make healthcare really part of research and a legitimate scientific activity rather than something you have to do to get over the regulatory hurdles, right? Because I think, Alan, I think that the clinic can inform the basic science and vice versa, but only if they're connected enough to talk to one another. And so a lot of these public-private partnerships that are going on, like ADNI and others, are informing. You learn back. Well, maybe these biomarkers we put so much hope in, well, maybe these aren't so good after all, but we learn other signals and I think as we expand our knowledge that we're gaining from healthcare and patient experiences, then that can inform back into the basic science and the translational science. So at FDA, we're looking right now at how to bring together the world of clinical research and the world of healthcare through that glue of the electronic data that are connected and the ability to reach out. And Jonathan gave some good examples of that, where you actually have done research. You've actually learned important things about taking care of patients, utilizing that. But we have a long way to go. And how do we bring those regulated clinical trials and how they're done into a rather chaotic world right now of healthcare and actually yet gain data? And then how do we link the basic sciences in a realistic way? Because as we are now seeing the outcomes of basic science with targeted therapies and with with use of biomarkers and so forth to identify treatments, as you were talking about, then how do we learn from that, and how do we actually build on that and find out whether we made the right choices? So there's a tremendous opportunity here, but I agree there are tremendous challenges, and they're primarily cultural. Everybody's going to have to kind of change their ways, including the regulators. But because our job is to make sure that evidence is gathered and that we continue to learn even after products are being used, so that kind of changes our role a little bit to try to drive these changes so that the evidence generation is effective and timely and continuous. So I think that's going to be part of the role of the regulators, to try to drive that evidence and try to bring those communities together.
It's interesting because you seem to indicate that there's two axes of integration, right? There's integration between different worlds,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Healthcare, patients, and then you seem to say also around the data continuity over time, so that you have real-time pharmacovigilance data and so on in a capture that is not the traditional way of thinking about it. And I remember you working on the Sentinel system. I know you started in 2006-07 there was a collaboration, but the idea there was to capture every event as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. And so my question to you is, big data analytics, the fundamental difference really is our ability to capture granular data. But then the question is, traditionally for thousands of years, we've always used statistics. Statistics is a sampling strategy. You sample a population, you try to get pieces of the reality of a population. Here you're trying to say, I want to capture all of it, otherwise I can't really fluidify the regulatory system. Is that a statement that you can crystallize as a recommendation to say, unless we capture all the data for safety anyway, maybe not efficacy, that will be very hard to change the regulatory framework? Or am I overreading what you're saying?
I believe that because the regulators have to make decisions and healthcare has to make decisions about patient care, and there's probably some disagreement I have with Jonathan about making inferences, drawing inferences sometimes. You could capture every patient who was on a therapy, and we've seen this in some senses, and you still don't know the answer because you don't know why those people were put on that therapy versus some other therapy. And so in the background of the big data, there's channeling and there's biases and there's other things that could cause the results. Right. So it's not a panacea, and we're going to have to, but you can randomize. That's what we're interested in. You can randomize within healthcare. Why not? Okay? If there are multiple choices, can you wash the patient with chlorhexidine, or can you do something to them? Okay, you can do that. And where the answers are subtle, you might have to do that. Right. But there's no reason you have to have this giant separate structure that you set up that takes many years, or maybe is unanswerable, because you say, I have to do it in this other world.
So if I may, before I go to you, Alan, I'd like Jonathan to have a right of reply. And here it is. You keep hearing that big data is the solution, big data is going to be big, it's going to be good, it's going to be,
good.
The panacea. Then on the other hand, you keep hearing that, wait a minute, the power of scientific evidence relies on the ability to do controlled experiments with blinding prospectively and so on, and therefore it's going to be very hard for you to take a big data. And the question then therefore is, do you think we're mature enough in our understanding of big data analytics, or do we need further research in there? And what is your sense of what we just heard?
Yeah, that's a great question. We clearly need more research on the research methods.
Yes.
This is an area where we have an opportunity, and we don't yet know how to best capture the opportunity. That said, we shouldn't miss the opportunity to take advantage of the signals that are in front of us.
Right.
When we have an entire population, and to your point, not just a sample, what can we learn from that population? There have been, and Janet certainly knows this better than I do, a number of drugs that have had problems, and the pharmacovigilance that you alluded to can be accelerated by the work of Sentinel that you've led, and that's absolutely terrific. When I, in the interest of the number of floors, so I gave an abbreviated description of the trials, it was actually cluster randomized by hospital, and that allowed the necessary rigor for that process. What we really need to understand is a whole field is really at the cusp of development in terms of adaptive trial design, pseudo-randomization, when different strategies, as existed in the reduced MRSA trial, were in equipoise. There's no rational reason that one should be preferred or a patient is benefited or deprived should they be on one of any number of competing arms. And the opportunity to suggest one of those arms is part of what I would hope we would cultivate as a social dialogue about a social contract to learning, because I should have no rational reason for a preference. I'm not saying that if I have some strong bias that is not rational, that might need to be entertained otherwise, but that we need to cultivate a literacy in terms of the knowledge development. One other point about the data science versus the analytics. What we have also is the opportunity to move from, what's really business intelligence, descriptive statistics, at times even diagnostic, to really things that are predictive, and to the work that you've so elegantly led at NIH that are ultimately prescriptive or tied to a prediction of what's likely to happen for the individual. And that's where business intelligence and data science begin to break apart. Traditional descriptive statistics say, how does this patient look like a group, however large that group is? When you get to the data science, and this is really the intriguing part, the question is, what can we learn from that massive group that's relevant to this particular patient? Why is that important? And why are the methodologies complementary? In a randomized controlled trial, to the best extent possible, the single variable is isolated. In the messiness of real medicine, the single variable is rarely isolated. So an advantage for the adaptive trial design, these practical methodologies, are that they tend to embrace the messiness, but they're not perfect. To the extent, though, that you use data science as opposed to descriptive statistics, you begin then to look at the interaction between heart disease and diabetes and obesity, for example, rather than just the single isolated variable. And that's the area that's so ripe for additional research.
I'd like the audience to hold this thought, because it has a profound implication on how we will train the scientific workforce of the 21st century. So hold that thought. Ellen, you've been observing and interacting and leading and advocating in this system for 20 years, coming from a completely different perspective of life and professional experience. Tell us, are we missing anything?
Yeah.
Or would you advocate?
First of all, probably the only one here who actually has construction experience. So hydraulic elevators are very slow, and if you go to the World Trade Center, let's use that rather than Trump Tower, you could be in an elevator very, very quickly. So let's just deal with that. Also, let's just talk about the value of advice. I'm not resistant to giving advice. I constantly give it to my husband and children, and it's dutifully ignored. But let's talk a little bit at 30,000 feet about what I would tell the president, the next president. First of all, in healthcare, because the president has a lot on their mind, so it's important to understand that. It does start with the patient. It really does start with the patient, and that's just not a word. Patients are different, their needs are different, they're not tied together in one. I mean, what choices you make at age 30 are going to be different at 80, depending on the disease setting. So you have to understand that the idea of patient-centered research or outcomes, just like the utility of science, Alan, is ultimately going to be, it's important to me if it impacts me. So that's really important. So I think you start with the vision. What is it you want? What is it you want to achieve? Because I don't think you can get any place without the vision. But the implementation is really important. So the president can't do all of this. The leadership that he or she chooses at the NIH, at the FDA in key roles is really going to be incredibly important, because you cannot implement without that. And that's incredibly important. And we don't spend enough time talking about leadership. I just also want to say that vision without execution is hallucination. So the ability to really understand from this vast amount of data what you really want to achieve is highly complicated, but it is doable. But if we don't change our world and the way we're thinking, and if we don't change culture, and Janet knows more than anybody about the change of culture and collaboration, it's going to be very hard to achieve these things. The world is changing so quickly. Look at this election. All rules, everything's changed. People have, and there is an urgency. And I don't think we've tapped on two things. This report is a very good report, and I have some specific suggestions that are tangible in what Janet did and others. I know a fair amount of big data from PCORI and about PCORNet and about Sentinel and connecting these things. But if we don't have the sense of urgency, it's going to be very difficult. And urgency means data that's meaningful. There's a lot of data out there that is a lot of noise that doesn't mean anything. So how to really curate that data so you have meaningful outcomes and get there faster is really going to be very, very important. So those are just top line issues, and then I have some specifics if you want later.
Thank you. And so you've had interactions with the FDA, and you've been a champion, along with Janet, about the breakthrough designation, which has that sense of urgency to it, right? On the other hand, you also hear the worries of patient groups relative to approvals. They're not urgent enough. Others are more cautious. They say we don't have enough proof. Is there any in between where you could essentially think of solutions that are patient sensitive in a good way, and yet at the same time regulatory rigorous, scientifically rigorous? And maybe I'll give both of you an opportunity to respond. Let
me try first. The answer is yes. And as I said before, patients don't come together in a neat bow. If you have a cold, what you're going to take as a medication, or if you have a headache, is different than if you have a glioblastoma. So there are differences. There are differences between consumers, public health, and fatal diseases, and those decisions are very, very different. And patient preferences are really incredibly important. Even in fatal diseases, some patients may say, I want some quality, I want palliative care, and don't torment me with these drugs that are going to ruin my quality. Others may say, I want to fight. So it's really different. I do think there is a way to incorporate patient preferences, science, and make informed decisions. I think Janet and the FDA really do a spectacular job on it. My experience is, and I'm obviously more focused on cancer, but I understand the entire ecosystem. The collaboration, the new coordination, this new cancer center will integrate data. It will integrate biologics. It will take important statistical things from diagnostics and obviously drugs. But more importantly, these decisions will be informed by disease experts who know the natural history of the job, and it will be guided by bringing patients into these equations. So I think it is possible to please and to get what's best for patients by incorporating them and to make these decisions weighted on the levels of evidence and the priorities that those patient groups have. So I think that there is a sensible middle course, and nobody would expect major decisions out of a regulatory body that are, if we have safe and effective protocols to make really decisions that are, that may be harmful. But if I'm a patient and I have 3 months in a fatal disease, my decisions are going to be very, very different.
You want to say something, Janet?
Yeah, well, I think this probably goes back to not just data, but information, the flow of information to people rather than just collecting information, because people are different in their risk tolerance and their desires, Ellen said, for what they're going to go for as far as a treatment. And we can't meet everyone's preferences, so we need to inform people and let them make often their own valid choices. For example, when the drug Tysabri was briefly removed from the market because of very serious brain infections that were occurring, the patients basically rose up. This was for multiple sclerosis, and said, no, we're going to take that risk. We're having trouble with the brain anyway, all right? But not everyone would want to take that risk, okay? So information is important. I know people who said, no, I'd rather take milder immunosuppression medication and take my chances with the disease. And other people think, well, this disease is doing a terrible thing to me, and I want to fight it, like you said. So I think it's not that helpful for the society, and I think it's mainly the media that focus on this: too fast, too slow, too high standards, too low standards, that sort of thing. This is a much more nuanced area, and I hope that the integration of healthcare, basic research, and the translational work can ameliorate this to some extent. We can have a more adult conversation about these issues.
So let me summarize the document that I had with a very, very good group: Jeremy Burke, Story Landis, Freeman Robowski, and Raynor Kington, with the help of many here, had to address the issue of who is going to do this. Who are the scientists? Are we training them in the right way? What do we expect from the next generation? Is this a priority for the country to think about the next generation of scientists? And I have to say, from my point of view at the NIH, when I was there, when people ask me, what is it you lose sleep over? I would always say it's the young investigators, the next generation of scientists. But it wasn't just an issue of funding. I think people always think, well, there's not enough funding. It's not that. It's really the nature of how we train our next generation that is at stake here. Why? Because there's a convergence in sciences. The convergence is not only between physical sciences, where we need mathematics and bioinformatics and the analytics that you were describing and the data sciences that you were describing. It's not just that. It's also the fact that you need people who are trained across disciplines. Why? Because it turns out that even in disease areas, in the traditional classification of diseases, now we see fundamental mechanisms that are actually crossing areas, from immunology and cancer, immunology and autoimmune disease, immunology and infectious disease, and so on. So this convergence of sciences, which we are seeing both in the nature of the multidisciplinary training that you need to master the multiple aspects that we were describing, in addition to the shifting sands of our understanding of disease pathology towards mechanisms rather than towards phenotypic descriptions of diseases, then you realize that the way we're training our young scientists has also changed in a divergent way. And this conflict of the convergence of sciences that we need to accommodate in our young generations of scientists is actually opposed by the divergence and the rigidity that have been accumulated in the system over the past 50 years. And so the conclusion was that it needed reform, it needed a rethinking, because the risk would be that we would continue to train at great expense young scientists who just duplicate the models of the past and replicate what their teachers is teaching them. And then you have other issues. It's really an expensive proposition nowadays to be trained in science. I mean, the tuition fees and the debt loads that physicians or others incur are very, very large. When you also think about the fact that today at the NIH, and I looked at those statistics and they're not getting any better, the median age at which you get a grant is 42. And when you look at the number of the percent of scientists that are 36 or older is 98%. So only 2% or less. If you looked at 1980, almost 50% were between the ages of 26 and 36. And what I used to say was that, you know, famous Nobel laureates like David Baltimore had his first grant when he was 27, and he has a Nobel Prize when he was 35. In the world of today, he would get his Nobel Prize before he gets his first NIH grant. That is not a logical outcome. And so when you look at that and you say, is this an NIH issue? It's not. It's actually, from our point of view, the point of view of the group, a systemic change that has occurred from K-12 education to undergraduate to graduate, and we gave examples of that in the text about what is the obstacle course you have to face to go from 18 years old to be independent maybe at 36, 38. It takes a lot of fortitude, 20 years basically of hard work and 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of graduate studies, a PhD, and then postdoc. And And at the end of the day, you say, well, nobody becomes a racehorse by longevity. I mean, you don't train 20 years before you can win the Preakness.
Right.
So we have something we need to work on. And so the speech to the president would be, you need a next generation strategy. You need a next generation fund to identify the best, the brightest, from high school all the way through, and follow them and facilitate their career pathways, facilitate early independence as soon as you can. Make that a national priority, because in the context of national competitiveness, this is probably the main driver of not only our success in healthcare, but our success as a society. So that was frankly what the group ended up with, that there are some changes you can always make, loan repayments and things like this, but they're marginal because they don't change the structure under which we are really asking our young people to dedicate their lives to science and to be the drivers of change. Imagine yourself in 1916, and imagine yourself at the National Academy then, and imagine what it is you would define as the next generation of scientists that would have brought the human genome and so on and so forth, right? You would say, we don't know enough. I mean, give freedom, give a lot of opportunities, and that's what the country did. Mm-hmm. But then, for whatever reason, we've become sclerosed. The medical schools have graduate degree granting programs that are so rigid that even the brightest of the bright gets cremated intellectually to go through this. So I think there is a time for not just a polite discourse, but a discourse of reform and revolution in the way we train our next workforce. If we can do it better than other countries, we will have won a major battle.
Elias, I want to make a point that it's anecdotal, but it's actually very important. There's a young woman that I've been mentoring, very young woman, very smart, honors degree. I was convinced she was going to be a neuroscientist. Went to graduate school with honors, full scholarship. Every summer I had her interning at the NIH, brilliant woman. And she's decided not to go into medicine. Why? Because everybody at the NIH that she worked with told her it's too long, too expensive, too difficult. They were saddled with debt. Now, this is, of course, an anecdotal story, and maybe she didn't have the fire in the belly, and maybe for a different reason she's not doing it. But what was discouraging is that every summer for 4 summers in a row, she had an internship, and it was the people from the NIH that all discouraged her not to go to medical school.
So I would add one additional challenge in your workforce problem, and that is that the modern science and technology workforce, biomedical science and technology workforce, is working in a very much broader array of settings than they ever had before. And what are we doing in order to train them appropriately for their next careers? So, for example, the statistic across science is 60% of new PhDs don't go into academic research, but we've been training them in the same way for 100 years in order to go into academic research. We don't want industry to have to totally retrain everybody. We don't want clinical practice to be considered, the loser of scientific training. How do we, in fact, construct the training experience in such a way that it actually can serve the needs of all the students, not just the students who are going to be little us when they grow up?
Could I say something about
Please.
that? I think, though, that there's a systemic inertia in the scientific enterprise. And what is it? It's overbuilt and overbuilt.
Overbuilt.
In this specific way, they need postdocs. And they need postdocs in their laboratories. And they're going to turn them out. And they're going to have them do the same basic research all over the country, right? Because that's what they need. And so you're up against a formidable challenge if you want to train them in some different way. And by overbuilt, I don't mean that the basic science enterprise is problematic or anything. I mean that it requires that amount of worker bees. And the same with the medical schools. They want the interns, they want the residents. They're going to train them in inpatient medicine, and everybody's going to go and supposed to do outpatient medicine.
That's right. It's a career and labor policy.
It's a labor. That's a very well said.
Just to make it worse, you're absolutely right. And just to make it worse, the system, as it is, works very well for the mentors, very well for the research institutions, very well for the funding agencies, because they get cheap labor.
For the next generation.
The problem is the students, and I would argue some of the recipients of the students. It's got to get looked at.
I can see that this is heating up the group here.
Actually, I think there are a number of notes for great optimism in your recommendation for a new pipeline. And two that come to mind that I think would be very much in the interest of the president would be, first, when you think of that pipeline, you said starting in grade school, the opportunity to embed health literacy. Ruth Parker, just a hero in the area of health literacy, part of the steering group. If I personally could do one thing to improve not only the ability to understand one's personal health, but to also understand effective consumerism in healthcare, be embedding health literacy. So I think that's a benefit of the program you suggest. I think there's another one as well. Which is when I think of healthcare, I think of two curves. I think of the curve that Mark showed where we have a challenge. I mean, when you think about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the interest on the debt, it squeezes out everything else. That has to be addressed. The flip side of it is when we invest wisely, as you've suggested, we have a capacity through new science, new technology to bolster our national competitiveness. And that's extraordinary. When you think of the capacity for our biggest export in the next era to be the dividends of new science that, really I think is apt to occur not only in the disciplines, but as you indicated, in a cross-cutting way, particularly the intersection of informatics and science. That's really not only an internal good, it's a national export.
Well, one of the things that Victor asked us to do is to focus. The problem with focusing is sometimes you put blinders on and you forget some aspects that you inherently are not able to perceive, like Alan was pointing out, the fact that we always need to bring back this continuous patient link across. So what I'd like to do is really open it up for a dialogue, a conversation with all of you. Have we missed something? Is there something that is underemphasized? And I know there are many points we couldn't cover, but you can see them in the articles. Anything that we need to take out of the symposium to enrich the fundamental recommendations that the National Academy of Medicine needs to make to the country. So with that, please let us know who you are and